Right, we're moving on to now an important presentation. We did a research session last year that was very well received. So we're including this year a presentation from Sue Dyson looking at the influence of rider-to-horse body weight ratios on equine gait and behaviour, a pilot study. This is when those of a certain girth tend to hold our stomachs in. So, Sue, over to you.
Rider size is a controversial issue, and there is a growing body of evidence that the human population is getting larger. However, there is limited evidence-based information about rider size and equine performance. There are a limited number of studies that have investigated the effect of weight, but these have largely been based on the use of dead weight, not live rider weight. This is a multifactorial issue. Factors that affect the horse are its height, its weight, its body condition score, its conformation, its fitness, and its soundness. For the rider, it is not only the weight that may be influential, but their fitness, their symmetry, balance, postural control, and previous injury. The activity with which the horse is engaged is also particularly relevant. The type of work, the intensity of work, the duration of that work, and the terrain over which the horse is being exercised. And then lastly, there's the saddle, the load-bearing area, and the fit and suitability, not only for the horse, but also for the rider. The importance of rider-to-horse body weight ratios was highlighted at the second International Saddle Research Trust workshop. And as a result of that, an initiative was taken forward by the British Equestrian Federation and World Horse Welfare, and they instigated a meeting attended by a number of the equine bodies from this country to discuss the issue, highlight priorities, and to seek funding from the industry for the research. And from this pilot study was born. This study aimed to assess gait and behavioural responses in horses ridden by 4 riders of similar ability but differing in body weight. It also aimed to assess the response to back palpation, the presence or absence of muscle tension or pain before and after exercise, to determine back dimension changes with exercise, to measure the magnitude and distribution of forces under the saddle during exercise, and lastly, to measure physiological responses to exercise with the 4 different riders. This afternoon, I can only focus on the gait and behavioural responses. This was a prospective, randomised crossover study involving 6 horses and 4 riders. The study was approved by the Clinical Ethical Review Committee of the Animal Health Trust. We had 6 horses which were used in the test, plus 2 reserves. The horses were recruited based on the fact that they were in full work and capable of being worked on the bit in trot and canter for a minimum of 30 minutes twice daily. All the horses were selected by myself, and I'm a Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons specialist in equine orthopaedics, between 6 and 8 weeks prior to the study. For inclusion in the study, the horses had to show no greater than a grade 1 out of 8 lameness in a single limb when ridden. They had to be of body condition score between 5 and 7 on a scale of 1 to 9. They had to be of body weight between 500 and 600 kilograms so that the rider to horse body weight ratio would be between 10 and 12% for the lightweight rider, greater than 12 and up to 15% for the moderate rider, over 15 but less than 18% for the heavy rider, and greater than 20% for the very heavy rider. The owners agreed that an independent, qualified saddle fitter would assess saddle fit and make adjustments as deemed necessary, ideally more than 1 month prior to the study, in order to minimise any adverse influences of the saddle over the horse's performance. Our 4 riders were volunteers. They all rode to a similar standard but differed in body weight. The light rider was an experienced rider who had competed in British eventing to intermediate level and in British dressage. She was a British Horse Society intermediate instructor and had professional riding experience of more than 25 years, and at the time of the study was an equine technician at the Animal Health Trust. The moderate rider was also an experienced rider who had competed up to medium level in British dressage. She had professional riding experience of 5 years and was also an equine technician at the Animal Health Trust. Our heavy rider was a British Horse Society instructor with professional riding experience of more than 25 years. And our very heavy rider was an experienced rider for more than 25 years. These were our 6 horses. You can see that they're somewhat variable in their shape and stamp. We were somewhat disappointed when the horses arrived at World Horse Welfare, which is where we carried out the study, to find that horse 3, body score, condition score 8, and horse 5, body condition score 7.5, had increased in their body condition score since they had been first evaluated 4 to 6 weeks previously. The tack, including the girth, and any additional saddle pads and or numner worn by each horse each day, together with the pliance format, were weighed, and the approximate weight for each horse was 10 kilograms. The study took place over 5 days. On each morning, at 7 o'clock, the horses were weighed, and at 8 o'clock, each rider was weighed, wearing their riding equipment. We also measured the height of the riders, which enabled us to calculate the body mass index. We can see that our riders varied in height from between 162 and 185.5 centimetres. Their mean weights ranged from 60.8 to 142.1 kilograms. The body mass index is the weight divided by the height squared. If we compare with what is recommended as being normal or overweight or obese, we can see that both our moderate and our heavy riders were both categorised as being overweight. Our very heavy rider was obese. We evaluated the gait with the horses moving in hand before each test, and we also evaluated the gait throughout the test, both subjectively and objectively. For the objective measurements, we had placed inertial measurement units on the horse's pelvis, on the withers, and on the pole. We assessed the saddle fit for the rider and the rider's position in the saddle. With respect to the length of the saddle being appropriate or otherwise for the rider, it was deemed to be correct if the rider was sitting in the centre of the saddle with clearance both in front and behind the rider's seat. The saddle was deemed to be short if the rider was sitting on the back of the cantle, as we see with the heavy rider. The saddle seat was deemed to be very short if the rider's seat extended beyond the back of the cantle. Each rider rode each horse in a randomised order. They performed a standardised 30-minute exercise protocol that consisted mainly of trot and canter, and horses were ridden in their usual tack. The test was called by Rebecca Young, who also recorded any untoward events, like, for example, the horse spooking in the corner. Selective parts of each test, standardised parts, were video recorded by Anne Bondy for subsequent evaluation of the horse's behaviour. Cheryl Chan and Mary Tivey, who were responsible for the heart rate and respiratory rate monitoring, were also responsible for documenting the time at which the horse performed transitions, so that could be compared with the force mat data that was being acquired throughout the ridden test. We have performed a number of behavioural studies in ridden horses, supported by the Saddle Research Trust and World Horse Welfare. And we have developed an ethogram which is a description of behaviours which we use during ridden exercise. We have identified, based on comparison between non-lame and lame horses, 24 behavioural markers which are most consistently associated with musculoskeletal pain. By comparison of lame and non-lame horses, we have been able to show that display of 8 or greater of these behavioural markers is likely to reflect underlying musculoskeletal pain. We have facial markers, the ears being back for more than 5 seconds or repeatedly placed backwards. Aspects of the eye expression, an intense stare, partial or complete closure of the eyelids, or exposure of the white of the eye. The tongue being exposed or protruding. The mouth being open for more than 10 seconds. The bit being pulled through to one side. We have body markers, the head being consistently tossed up and down in a repeated fashion. The head moving sideways repeatedly. The head being tilted on one side. And the movement of the tail either being clamped to the back of the horse or constantly swishing in a vigorous fashion. There are also gait markers, repeated changes in rhythm, the horse becoming rushed or slowing in its rhythm. Spontaneous changes of gait, for example, breaking from canter to trot. The horse moving on 3 tracks, as we see here. Reluctance to go forwards, dragging the toe, stumbling. Sudden changes of direction against the rider's aids, and bucking and rearing. The behaviour during the ridden test was assessed prospectively during every test by myself. The behaviour was also assessed retrospectively from video recordings of standardised sections of each test. We had a predetermined abandonment protocol. If a horse demonstrated 10 or greater of the 24 behavioural markers, the test was terminated immediately by the blowing of a whistle. If the horse developed a grade 3 or greater lameness in a single limb, or grade 2 out of 8 lameness in 2 or more limbs, again the test was terminated immediately. All the tests for the heavy rider and for the very heavy rider were abandoned. For the very heavy rider, all the horses became lame. For the heavy rider, 5 horses became lame and 1 demonstrated 10 behavioural markers in canter. 1 test out of 12 for the moderate rider was also abandoned due to lameness. There was a difference between the very heavy and the heavy riders in terms of how long the test was performed before it had to be terminated. For the heavy rider, the mean time was 16.6 minutes with a range of 9 to 25.5, whereas for the very heavy rider, there was a mean of 8.3 minutes with a range of 6 to 19. We therefore, after each rider had ridden every horse, changed the protocol, and only the light and moderate riders were repeated, because we felt it would have been unethical to repeat the tests with the heavy or the very heavy rider. This summarises the types of lameness shown by the horses. We can see that for horse 3, on each occasion that the test was abandoned, the horse was lame on the left hind limb. However, for horse 5, on one occasion it showed a right forelimb lameness and a left hind limb lameness, and with another rider it showed a left forelimb lameness. And horse 6, lame left hind with one rider and lame right fore with another. So it was not consistent in which limb every horse became lame. If the test was abandoned, either due to more than 10 behavioural markers or because of lameness, the gait was re-evaluated 45 minutes later in hand, and all horses appeared non-lame at the walk and trot in hand. At the end of the 5 days, all horses were moving as well or better than when they started, when ridden by the light and moderate riders. When we looked at the comparison between my subjective evaluation of the gait and the objective evaluation of the gait, we found that the lame limb was in agreement for all horses. However, there were very significant variations among individual horses' responses to riders, which is not surprising. There were some significant differences among the riders. Here we see results for hip height difference on the left rein and the right rein. And here we can see the variation between the left and right sides, and there is no significantly statistical difference between any of the riders. However, when we look on the right rein, we can see that the direction of asymmetry is significantly different for the very heavy rider compared with the other riders. Despite our attempts to improve the fit of owner's tack prior to the study, saddle fit was not perfect, but was considered adequate for the purposes of the investigation. Although previous work has shown that ill-fitting saddles have the potential to adversely influence force distribution and magnitude in equine performance, the horses performed very satisfactorily despite the ill-fitting saddles with riders L and M. And this mimics a situation in the field. When the rider is ridden by different riders, the saddle fit is unlikely to fit all riders. The length of the saddle was appropriate for riders L and M. Rider H sat on the back of the saddle for 5 of the 6 horses, and rider very heavy was over the back of the saddle in all horses. The shoulder, hip, and heel were not in alignment for any of the horses for both the heavy and the very heavy rider. The normal rider of horse 2 was 92 kilograms, similar to the rider weight H. But the normal rider was considerably shorter, being only 157 centimetres compared with 185.5. And this additional height is likely to influence their position in the saddle and their ability to be in balance, their weight distribution, and the position of their centre of gravity relative to the horse's centre of gravity. The body mass index of both the moderate and the heavy riders was considered overweight, but all tests were abandoned for the heavy rider, but only 1 of 12 for the moderate rider, which indicates to us that this abandonment is an effect of weight rather than the body mass index. Horses 3 and 5 had increased in body condition score after selection for the study. We have to recognise that that may possibly have an adverse influence on their performance. An overweight horse is less able to work efficiently than a horse of appropriate weight. Obesity potentially compromises equine health. When we look at the behavioural scores, this was the retrospective analysis of the videos, we can see that there were significant differences in the scores for the light and moderate riders compared with the heavier riders. And this was highly statistically significant. Likewise, the differences between the scores for the facial expression of the lighter riders was considerably lower than for the heavier riders. Head position, too, the value was considerably lower for the lighter riders compared with the heavier riders. So we saw significant differences in the total behaviour score, the facial expression score, and the head position score among riders. There were differences in head and tail movement and the gait markers, but they were not statistically significant. So our preliminary conclusions are that clearly there is an effect of rider to horse body weight ratio. There is also potentially an influence of the rider height and therefore their position in the saddle and their weight distribution. Because all the tests for both the heavy and the very heavy riders were abandoned, we do not know what the lower rider-horse body weight cutoff may be. The results are not necessarily applicable to lower level activity, for example, hacking at the walk, but we did measure significantly higher forces under the saddle for the very heavy rider. Nor are the results necessarily applicable to fitter animals or those which have been slowly adapted to increasing weight to carry. The results of the study cannot necessarily be transferred to more intense work or work of longer duration. This study does not mean that heavy riders should not ride, but suggests that if they do, they should ride a horse of appropriate size and fitness with a saddle that is correctly fitted, not only for the horse, but also for the rider. And the logical conclusion from that is that it may not be possible to fit a saddle to both the horse and the rider, depending upon the length of the horse's back. Remember, force equals mass times acceleration, so weight has a direct effect on the forces exerted on the horse's back via the saddle. That is why the balance of the rider, the alignment of their shoulder, hip and heel, and their ability to sit straight are also important. The position of the rider's mass and the horse's centre of gravity are important. We concluded that any adverse influence of less than ideally fitting tack may be accentuated markedly by heavier riders. But this was only a pilot study. There are many unanswered questions. Where is the cutoff between 15 and 18%? And what are the take-home messages? Does the horse-rider combination look right? If it doesn't, it probably isn't. Is the horse's back of long enough length to accommodate a saddle long enough for the rider so that they can sit in the centre of the saddle? Can the rider sit with their shoulder, hip and heel in alignment? Increasing horse body weight is not a solution. The horse and rider should be optimally fit, and regular saddle checks are important for both the horse and for the rider. I need to thank all the organisations that generously donated money for the project, for the groups that provided material in kind, for the riders, and most especially to the very generous horse owners who lent their horses for a total of 6 days. I also have to thank many of the other people that were involved in this study. It was only a pilot study, but it did involve a large number of scientists. Thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to try and answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Sue. Questions, comments on an important piece of work? Yeah.
Thank you very much. Doug Smith, Riding for the Disabled. So once again, thank you very much for this research. You are underpinning what we've been doing for many, many years. I know it's just the first part of it. Way before I was involved with Riding for the Disabled, we've had a policy about calculating the maximum capacity that our horses can carry. But we don't only take into account weight, we have to take into account disability and the effect that disabilities can have on. We have to be very, very careful for the pairings. But what I think is the potential for this is that there's been a lot of good work done over the last few years about the riding world being seen as non-elitist and inclusive. The last thing we want to be seen is as weightist. So I think what we must make sure goes out, as you said on one of your latter slides, this is a combination issue, not a weight issue. We've all seen the teenager who doesn't want to part with their little pony that'll turn on a tanner and give them threatens change, and doesn't want to move on to a thoroughbred where it's more a case of bridge to engine room, and parents exercising the ponies for the children. So I think what we need to be very careful of, the message that goes out is this is not just about weight. And to evidence that, years ago, before I got completely overtaken by Riding for the Disabled, I used to do quite a bit of judging. And one lady I judged was a very handsome woman who was proud of the fact that she stood over 6 foot tall and weighed over 20 stone. She had 2 horses, a Clydesdale and a Shire, both of whom were well over 17.3 and well up to carrying her weight. But her daytime job was as a professional wrestler. So she was so in control of her body, she was very, very light in the saddle. And believe me, when she put leg 2, the horse moved. And she did very well. And I must just add, as a rider, I didn't give her good marks because I was frightened of her.
Thank you. Any other comments, questions? Clearly, I agree completely. The communications list needs to be handled very carefully. One there, and then one there, and then we'll have a pause. Have to pause.
Eva Maria Brumer from the Anglo-European Stud Book. Thank you very much for a very informative talk. Did you find there was any significant difference between the different types of horses, in that we noticed that obviously these 6 horses were of slightly different body shapes themselves, and this is not just a weight but also a horse type issue. And did you find that there were certain type of horses that might have shown adverse reactions sooner to body weight than others, or were they all the same?
Absolutely not, no. The responses of the 6 horses were remarkably similar.
Thank you, that's very helpful.
Question there.
Thank you. Victoria Highfield from Online for Equine. Firstly, I think that research like this is much needed, and I think it's fantastic. One thing that I'd like to know is what's the next step, really? I know, sorry. From a retailer's point of view, we have an awful lot of demand growing in what's referred to as the curvy rider section. And the level of rider, we're not talking just a walk and trot rider. We're talking riders who are going out, they're low-level eventing. Do you feel that there can be some form of application between this impact and maybe riding at low-level BE? Where do you see the research going?
Well, I think that we need to look closer at the riders who are approximately in the 90 to 95 kilo area, because these are clearly the level at which we're going to have the most problems. In saying that, we can have an equal problem with an adult riding a small pony, a normal size. I could get on a small pony and still be too big for it. But we need to focus on around the 92 kilogram mark, and with riders of different heights, because we've identified the fact that the position of the rider in the saddle is going to be influenced by their height and the fit of the saddle to them. So we need to repeat the study using a very similar design, but with several riders who are around the 92 kilogram level of different height, and crossing over the study so they do it once with a normal saddle for the horse and once in a saddle that better fits them, the individual rider. So that's what we would like to do, but that obviously is dependent on funding. These studies don't happen without funding.
Good. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Sue. It's important work, and it's something that we clearly like to be kept informed with. So thank you very much. We're now...
Probably the most shocking thing was that it was like a graveyard with the walking dead.
They had so many lice on them that we had to do a full body clip to get rid of all the parasites before we could even start treating them.
The scale of it seemed enormous.
I think it opened the eyes of many members of the British public who hadn't seen animal cruelty before.